Sadly, there could be nowhere more appropriate to discuss climate change than this beautiful and fragile island, so recently converted with such sensitivity into this glorious spot, but which is in danger. Very severe and great and profound and immediate danger. As we saw at the big climate change talks in Glasgow last year, the Maldives, along with the Bangladeshis, I think were the ones pressing hardest as the ones that'll be the first under the waves if everything goes badly wrong. There could be no one more moving, more well-informed, more balanced, and more respected to tell us about this issue than David Wallace Wells. When we last met, he'd just been on stage with the great Brian Eno in a kind of very rock-starry event in London. When the whole idea of JLF Maldives was first mooted, his was literally, I think, the first name I put on the list because it was such an obviously perfect match. Sadly, I mean, I wish that it was otherwise. Wish that we could call David to someone like Slough or Birmingham or somewhere. Whoops, I mustn't say this out loud. That'll be inundated by emails. But his work on climate change and the pressing nature of it has gone very literally viral. His work has been exchanged and passed from person to person and been hugely effective and admired. And there could be no better way to start off our second weekend than let David take it away. I think it's only going to be a brief talk. Many of you will have heard already his longer talk with Peter Frankopan, but for those who missed it, this is a concentrated espresso gulp of David Wallace Wells. Please, David.
Thank you, Willie. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. It's really a privilege to be on this beautiful island, on this beautiful, fragile island, as Willie was saying, to be talking about this subject. And it's a big subject. It's, the future of the whole planet and the fate of humanity. So I've got 20 minutes, and I'd like to talk, I'd like to get to questions if possible. So I'm going to move a little quickly, but to sort of ground us, to make sure we don't get too dizzy in dealing with such a big subject in such a short amount of time, I just want to tell you first how I'm going to move through the subject, and that is basically to ask two big questions, two big orienting questions that I get asked a lot when people are interested in hearing what I have to say and think about the state of climate change, and those are, where are we with climate change? And where are we headed? So I want to start with where are we? And there are a few different ways of answering that question. One way is to say we are on Earth. That is where we are. And that sounds grounding and comforting and even kind of facile. But it's also the case that this is not the Earth that we've always known. It's not the Earth that we were raised on. It's not the Earth that our grandparents were raised on. And it's not the Earth that our ancestors evolved into modern humans on. The planet's today about 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. 1.2 degrees doesn't sound like very much, but it actually puts us entirely outside the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history, which means the planet is today hotter than it has ever been when humans were around to walk on it. And that means that everything that we've ever known as a species is in some way the result of climate conditions which we have already today left behind. Everything modern, the invention of agriculture, the development of the modern nation state, modern culture, geopolitics, everything came about in a different climate than the one that we are living in now. It's like, I often think, we've landed on a new planet. We've smuggled a civilization with us onto that planet, and we now have to figure out what of that old civilization, what of those old traditions and impulses will endure under these new conditions, what will have to be renovated and discarded, and what will have to be replaced wholesale. There are a lot of ways of thinking about what a different planet this already is. We can talk about the heat wave that's swallowing South Asia at the moment. It's been something like 40 degrees or hotter in much of India and much of Pakistan for about 10 weeks now. These are not on their own temperatures that are unheard of in these places, but to have it so consistently, so hot, is actually going to, in a perverse way, produce a lot of scientific knowledge we haven't had before, because we haven't seen humans exposed to heat for this amount of time. And it is something that that length of heat wave at that intensity is something we've just never seen before. We could talk about the Category 5 cyclones that hit Mozambique within a few months of each other a couple of years ago. Never had that kind of sequence before. The Pacific heat dome in the American and Canadian Northwest last summer, which a climate scientist told me just a week or two ago, before climate change would have been considered a 1 in 8 million year weather event, which means you'd have to run all of human history 25 times over to encounter a weather extreme like that once. And we had it just last summer. We could talk about the wildfires in California, which have grown over the course of a century from years that would routinely have tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 acres burn, to now 4 of the last 5 years burning more than 1.5 million acres. So much wildfire that in 2020, there was more pollution in the western US from wildfire than from all other industrial and human activity combined. But actually the thing that I like to focus on and think about most when I think about how different the world is are the weather impacts on the American city of Houston, which has been hit by 5 of what were once called 500-year storms in 5 years. Now, we know now that that term is sort of outmoded by climate change, but it's useful to keep in mind as a reminder of just how out of whack the climate system is. 500 years ago, there were no Europeans in North America at all. So we're talking about a storm that we'd expect to hit once during that entire history. And Houston's been hit by 5 of them in 5 years. So it's literally millennia of extreme weather compressed into half a decade. And that's just at 1.2 degrees. So that's one way of answering the question where we are. We're on Earth, but it's a different Earth. Another way is to say we're in 2022. Now that means it's been about 30 years since the UN IPCC published its first climate change report, signaling to the world unmistakably this was a threat and informing them about what was contributing and what many of the likely impacts would be. 30 years. It's been a few years since a sort of activist moment began with climate strikers and Extinction Rebellion and protests in the street all around the world, turning a new kind of rhetorical page in our public discourse about climate the world over. And yet it also means, being in 2022, that we are literally at the peak of all global historical emissions, which means we are now emitting today more carbon than we've ever emitted ever in the history of the world. So despite 30 years of knowledge, despite 5 years or so of really intense activism, despite a very clear awakening on the part of almost the entire world, we're actually not moving in the right direction. We are still, in 2022, moving in the wrong direction, contributing more and more damage to the future of the planet. And it's really important to keep in mind when we think about these things that carbon, it is a gas. You think it just will float away into space, but it actually hangs there for centuries, maybe even millennia. So simply reducing the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere isn't enough. We've already effectively permanently changed the climate conditions that humans will forever after live under. And that's just 1992. Now, I'm 39 years old, and I remember when climate change was an issue, but not a very big deal. But actually half of all of the emissions that we've ever put into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels in the entire history of humanity have come in just 30 years, which means my lifetime basically contains this entire story. When I was young, this was a long-term threat. It was talked about in terms of generations and centuries. And now we have scientists tell us a few decades to get a handle on the problem, to make sure that the future remains relatively livable, relatively hospitable, relatively prosperous, relatively just. And the language makes me uncomfortable, but that really means that this is a story like we used to only see in mythology and theology. You know, in my lifetime, we've taken the planet from seeming stability to the brink of catastrophe. And now we have about that much time, presumably it will be in my lifetime too, 30 more years, to really take control of the problem and secure a future for the planet. So that's, 2022. We talked about we're on Earth, we're in 2022. We are also, as Willie was saying in his introduction, we are also in the Maldives, which is to say we are literally on the front lines. We are in one of the places on the planet that is most imminently at risk from these threats. Many climate advocates from this country will talk about 2 degrees of warming, which I think is quite likely, as something of a death sentence for the nation, although they'll also be careful to say that there's much that we can do to prevent that level of warming and to take action to try to adapt and preserve as much of this country as we possibly can. And that, I think, is a really critical lesson here in the Maldives, in addition to being here on Earth and here in 2022. And that is when we think about these climate impacts, we talk about storms and sea level rise and drought, and we talk about deadly heat and wildfire and everything else that on the litany of disaster. It seems as though climate impacts will therefore make up the whole of our destiny, not just in a place like the Maldives, but really on the planet as a whole. I think it's really important to recognize, especially in a place like this that is so vulnerable, that the climate impacts are only half the story. The human response is the other half, and it is very much uncertain, but it is possible that that response will be sufficient to limit warming to something close to a manageable level and to take action on the other side to make sure that we can still live in a transformed world. Climate impacts are not the whole of our destiny. They're just the natural landscape on which we are going to build our future. And as I said, that's, I think, an especially important message in a place like this. So that's where we are and where we're going. One way is to say we're like heading off a cliff. I mean, when we talk about how high the emissions are and how bad everything, the charts of carbon emissions are just really terrifying to look at. We've broken the ceiling on, the carbon conditions for the last million years. We don't yet know what kinds of disturbances that's going to cause precisely. But another way of thinking about it is that we have begun to take action at an unprecedented pace as well. So I finished my book in the fall of 2018, early fall of 2018. I'd never heard of Greta Tunberg. She had just started striking outside of Swedish parliament as literally a lonely, friendless 14, 15-year-old by herself. 4 years later, whatever it is, 3.5 years later, she's the face of a global political movement that led marches numbering in the millions all around the world and literally forced the attention of the world's most powerful people onto this issue. That is an incredible pace of political change, even if we just consider it as purely rhetorical over the last 3 or 4 years. When I finished my book, climate denial was still an incredibly powerful weapon against climate action. Now I think in part because of the extreme weather that we've all seen, it is almost nowhere on the planet with the possible exception of 1 or 2 figures here or there, but essentially it's been banished from public discourse. And it's been replaced by a different kind of climate delay, and that's not great, but it still counts as progress that nobody in any real position of power anywhere in the political or corporate world is debating the facts of climate change and the urgency of the threat. That is really a quite significant move. It is also the case that over the course of those years, the whole trajectory of global ambition has really, really changed. A few years ago, nobody was talking about eliminating carbon emissions, only reducing them. And very few countries had made even meaningful promises about their own individual actions there. Now, just even over the course of the pandemic, there were major net zero pledges made by basically all the member nations of the EU and the EU as a whole, by the UK, by South Korea, by Japan, by the US, and most notably by China, coming out of Glasgow, which wasn't all that significant a climate conference. Now something like 85 or 90% of the global economy and 85 to 90% of global emissions are now, at least in theory, committed to a program of decarbonization, relatively rapid decarbonization. That is quite remarkable. There's still paper pledges. Basically nobody's making the investments that are necessary to get us there. But it's still significant that when people in power talk about where the world needs to go, they now talk about climate action in incredibly urgent terms. And in part because there's been, at the same time, this incredible technological progress that has rapidly driven down the price of renewable power. It just makes economic sense just about everywhere in the world to be pushing for a greener future, a greener energy future, as opposed to a more fossil-dependent one. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, says that solar power is now the cheapest electricity in history. I've seen estimates that 90% of the world now lives in places where renewable power is cheaper than fossil power, 90% of the world. And in a lot of parts of the world, it's now cheaper to open new renewable capacity than to even continue running the old fossil energy systems. And that means that those pledges that have been made at COP conferences and all around the world, they can be made real. They won't be made real on their own, but there are not enormous economic or financial obstacles to them in the way that there were just 5 or 10 years ago. And to fulfill those promises doesn't mean accepting a burden of a lower standard of living or a higher price of energy. It means the opposite, a greener future, a happier future, and maybe most significantly, I think, a healthier future, because we are also learning these years very quickly a lot about how bad air pollution, particularly from the burning of fossil fuels, is. 10 million people a year are dying from air pollution, and we have the power to essentially eliminate that public health burden through a rapid green energy transition, in addition to stabilizing the planet and securing the future on all these other points. Because of all that, we used to say a business as usual future for the climate was something like 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. So that means something like 4 times the amount of warming that we've had today. Now most people would say business as usual is something like 2.5 degrees, maybe 3. And probably we're going to do something quite significant to drive it below that. That's a really incredible amount of progress in a couple of years. It's just at the moment notional progress. It has to do with how quickly we think we can act more than how quickly we are acting. But the future suddenly looks considerably more hopeful and optimistic than it did to me even when I finished my book, which, as I said, maybe you guys think 3.5 years ago is a really long time. I think it's a really short time, and the whole picture of the world has changed. And that's especially significant to me because when I was writing the book, when I was really deep in this research, I was looking back at generations of environmental activism in which almost nothing at all had been accomplished on climate. There had been conferences and mass protests since about 1992. And the carbon emissions kept going up and the projections kept going up, and nobody really took seriously the idea that we would meaningfully bend this curve anytime soon. Now, over the course of 4 or 5 years, the entire picture of the future has changed. That's pretty exhilarating. But it hasn't changed fast enough to allow us to really dream that we could defeat climate change. We've also waited too long for that opportunity. So we're now in a kind of confusing place. What we used to think of as possible, the really high-end warming scenarios, the really apocalyptic ones, they're probably not going to happen. But nothing like the present climate is going to endure either. It's going to get worse from here. How much worse is up to us, but possibly somewhat considerably worse. And that means narratively, conceptually, psychologically, politically, we're actually in a considerably more confusing time than we were just a few years ago. We can't really think in terms of apocalyptic futures or in terms of Pollyanna futures. Both of those are irresponsible and not responsive to the facts on the ground. We're in the muck already. We have to figure out how to live in that muck, in part by preventing more warming and making sure that we don't get deeper into it. But we also have to try to figure out what the world looks like from there, not depending on older ideas of what the natural environment should be, what normal temperatures are, and probably get used to a significant amount of climate disruption. The sense of changing seasons, much hotter summers, more intense rainstorms. All of these things are going to be a part of our lives. And because climate is so fundamental and so large, I think that they amount to essentially a new era in human history, that this century will be defined in very profound ways by climate impacts in much the same way that the last century was defined by the industrialization of the developing world, financial capitalism, etc. Climate change is the story of this century, but it's up to us to write a better story in that world, as opposed to just sitting back and letting an uglier one unfold through our own inaction. So that's my talk. I don't know how much time we have left, but whatever time we have, I'd love to take any questions and talk to anyone.
Yes, thank you. I thought what you said about we are in a confusing time is so significant. A lot of people don't really know what to do. You see, it's all left to action. So how do you think one could go about action from an individual level right up to the political level? Because a lot of us, we're always hearing, do something, and a lot of people don't even know what to do.
You mentioned Greta, and I think we all know that 18 to 25-year-olds today are incredibly woke, they're incredibly energetic, and they're ready to go. But how do you take all of that energy and move it from hashtags and paper pledges to actually putting out the fires?
If I could piggyback on yours.
Yes.
And as woke as the 18 and 25-year-olds are, newspapers such as my favorite, the New York Times, which you write for, they are giving very bad news today. Their reviews of restaurants and dining, they've become part of the 20-year-olds with a photo camera and just writing about anything. There's food being made, consumed, that's so terrible for the planet. And then you have the Times reviewers celebrating them. Where does that fit into this whole idea of what's good or bad for the planet?
Thank you, Dave. A question, I know you've written a lot about pandemics too. I know you did a lot about pandemics, and in lots of ways the pandemic has changed people's behaviour. Are there lessons that we can learn that are positive in terms of what's needed? So it's not just nudges and small little cuts. There are much deeper ways of changing some of the things you're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to start at the beginning, I don't see a distinction really between individual action and political action, because I think that the most important individual action is political action. But that doesn't mean necessarily protests, marching in the street, or running for office. Political action begins with conversation. It begins with spreading awareness. I think most polling shows that many more people carry around climate anxiety than talk about it, even with those that they love. I think we're in that way living all around the world in a sort of climate denial. And the more that we bring our anxieties out and bring our concerns out, I think that, that awareness leads to political change. But there are higher levels of political engagement than that, including protest and running for office. I think being in touch with local officials. Anybody who's living in a democracy anywhere in the world, and even people who are not, have a path before them to try to redirect the behavior of their leaders, who are the people who really have power to make the systemic changes that are necessary. And I would urge, personally I do and will and would, whatever the verb is, urge people who ask me that question all the time to think in terms of systemic change. There are almost 8 billion people on the planet, and we are in a position today where if we hope to achieve any of our climate goals, it will require really profound planetary transformation. And that means that we need something much bigger than a few million, even a few 100 million people making changes to their own lives. We need a new kind of agriculture. We need a new form of transportation. We need new energy systems, new electric grids, new infrastructure. And those are things that are simply beyond the capacity of even massed individuals to achieve without government power. The price tag on all of this. I mentioned that there's a sort of really powerful economic argument for decarbonization. That's very true. But the price tag, the upfront price tag on that is pretty high. It just comes back very quickly. And so the the institutions in the world that have the power to make those kinds of changes are not entirely, but almost entirely governments, and that means that in order to take control of this challenge, we sort of need to do it through politics. The question of sort of the I don't know exactly how to put it, like whether it matters that young people care so much, and what we can do to make it matter. I look at the world today and I think it's completely transformed it's been completely transformed by those people. When I watched the Glasgow climate conference, I saw, president and prime minister after president and prime minister get up on stage and talk about climate change as an existential threat. I mean, Boris Johnson embarrassed himself with his apocalyptic rhetoric. That is not something that he or anybody in his position would have done just a few years ago. Now, there's a huge question of making those rhetorical commitments real in terms of investments. But I think we would not even be having that conversation if the global youth awakening hadn't happened, and whether the political awakening can extract concrete commitments from political leaders and corporate leaders to match their rhetorical commitments, I think is yet to be seen. But I certainly, personally, would be reluctant to minimize the achievement of those protesters. I think that it is unprecedented in environmental politics, and it may be unprecedented in global politics, how much difference has been made by that movement. We'll see what the next acts involve. It is the case that, unfortunately, we can't wait for these leaders to grow up to be old enough to be presidents of their countries. We have to sort of depend to some degree on the power apparatus that already exists. But I think we're already seeing many signs that people in those positions of real power are at least much more concerned, if not yet as concerned as I am, still much more concerned than they used to be. But that doesn't mean that the world is going to quickly shift into a state, I'm afraid, where everything is done entirely in line with climate action. And to the point about food, we all live in a state of climate denial and hypocrisy. I mean, that's true of us as individuals. It's true of us as climate advocates. It's, there are very few people on the planet who are truly living in line with these goals. And that is something that I think is a reasonable source of shame, both personal and public. But I also think it's an argument for sympathy and understanding. And when I think about that climate hypocrisy, which I think of as basically universal, it's a form of climate denial that we all live in. What I think is that it illustrates the individual action systemic problem divide, but it sort of offers a moral lesson about that, which is to say, we live in cultures, many of us, that treat hypocrisy as a kind of a personal sin. But you can also look at it as a form of collective ambition. That if we want to live in a world that is climate responsible, but in our daily lives don't quite live up to those standards, you can just think of that as like the belief that we should be better together than we are as individuals. And I think that that's both humane to us as people and points towards the right forms of action, which is to say collective as opposed to individual. Now, are we going to transform our food systems and our habits as consumers fast enough to meet the Paris goals? Well, I mean, as a defensive member of the media, I will say I think that as with the climate strikers and political rhetoric, I think the media is doing a much, much better job than they were doing 5 or 10 years ago. They're still doing a far from perfect job, absolutely. And I do think you're right that climate can and should be a much more central part of the way that we talk about almost everything that gets covered in the media and everything that we do in our lives. I think we are moving somewhat in that direction. I think, as with everything else on climate, we're just moving too slowly. But I think one encouraging development on the media side is that, when I first started writing about climate, it was understood to be, kryptonite to readers. It was like, this is what you do as a media organization if you want to serve the world. It's not what you do to get people excited about what you're writing. And that is not the case anymore. I mean, I wrote the article I originally wrote that eventually turned into the book was for a long time the most read article that the magazine I worked for at the time, New York Magazine, had ever published. And I now work at an institution, the New York Times, that, unprecedented in its history, has an enormous desk of climate reporters. They have an entire, in the same way that they have a DC bureau, they have a climate bureau. Now you can make the argument that climate is a bigger story than American politics, but the fact that there's any kind of equivalence there at all is really quite a remarkable sign of progress. Not everybody's there. There's a lot of bad media out there. Different parts of the world are handling things differently. But I think, at least, like I said, as with everything on climate, we're moving in the right direction. It's just a question of how fast. And I think you're right to say, not fast enough. And then on the pandemic question, I've sort of been asked some version of this question since February, March of 2020, by a number of, and almost every time I get asked it, I have a sort of a different answer because my sense of the meaning and the narrative of the pandemic has changed so much. And I think that itself is a lesson for climate change, that what we think of as these sort of static or uniform threats actually change quite dramatically over time based on the way that we're interacting with them, responding in terms of policy, but also responding culturally and psychologically. So that what seemed like a parallel in March 2020 might by December 2020 seem like a contrast, and then it flips back to being a parallel in whatever. The story is much messier and more uneven than we really can tolerate as individual intelligences. And I think we should prepare all of us for a lot of that cultural disruption and ideological and intellectual disruption over the next decades from climate. But I can tell a positive story about the pandemic and what it means for climate, and that is basically the one that you hinted at, which is early on, in the space of literally weeks, the entire world stopped. And everybody changed what they were doing. I mean, there was a point, I think in April or May of 2020, where more than 1 billion school children were out of school. Now, that might not have been the best move, but it signals that massive transformations of our societies are possible, and not just possible, but rapidly possible when we perceive a threat to ourselves and those around us. That's a really big and encouraging lesson when it comes to climate, because so often when people who are worried about this think about it, they think of it as an unmovable object, an enormous challenge. How do we, depose the fossil fuel industry? How do we replace all of those energy needs with green power? How do we feed people without, depending on deforestation? How do we extend promises of economic growth to the poorer people in the world without the benefit of cheap power? Or, that's no longer exactly true, but that's one of the ways it's been talked about over the last decade. And one reason why all of those challenges seem so hard is because the status quo always seems so entrenched. And I think the pandemic, among many other things, taught us that the status quo is not that entrenched and that movement can happen very, very quickly. But there are uglier lessons to the pandemic too, and I don't think it's a neat story of triumph. But I think it does tell us that the future is unpredictable and messy, and is even when we're dealing with a threat like the pandemic and with climate that is beyond our control, beyond our capacity to really contain, nevertheless the future that we nevertheless make the future that we are going to live in the face of those forces. And what kind of future that is ultimately up to us and up to the policies that we implement. Thank you.